To this day, fans still make the pilgrimage to the gates of Neverland Ranch, hoping for even a fleeting glimpse of the place their idol once called home. But the estate remains empty and firmly off limits to the public. Everything within its boundaries, every object, every room, every forgotten corner, belongs to Michael Jackson. So many personal possessions were left behind that they have filled not one, not two, but 5 separate warehouses. After 17 years of silence, those warehouses were finally opened, and what was waiting inside sent shockwaves far beyond the walls of Neverland. For years after Michael Jackson's death in 2009, the gates of Neverland Ranch stayed firmly shut. The estate seemed less like an abandoned property and more like a place that had simply been paused, frozen at a specific moment in time, waiting for something or someone that would never return. One section in particular attracted more curiosity than any other: a locked garage and a purpose-built warehouse that Jackson himself had overseen the design and construction of. These structures remain completely off limits, fueling endless speculation about what might be stored inside. When expectations finally leaned toward forgotten relics and quiet nostalgia, the doors were opened, and what people imagined and what they actually found never quite aligned. Even 17 years after his death, Neverland Ranch does not behave like ordinary property. It lingers in public consciousness more like a preserved fragment of cultural memory than a simple piece of real estate. That sense of living history was reinforced in 2024, when film crews returned to grounds to shoot scenes for a major Michael Jackson biopic, briefly transforming the once sealed estate into a working film set and pulling Neverland back into the global spotlight once again. To understand why these forgotten structures matter, it helps to understand what Neverland became at its peak. Michael Jackson purchased a property in 1988 and spent years transforming it into something that defied easy categorization. It was not simply a home. It was not simply an amusement park. It was a private world built for emotional escape, a place that existed somewhere between fantasy and reality, designed to reflect the inner life of the man who created it. Walking to the main foyer of the main house, it becomes immediately clear how personal the space was. The walls were lined with enormous paintings, many depicting Michael Jackson himself in whimsical or magical scenes. Statues were placed throughout the entrance, including one of a butler holding a tray of cookies, a warm, playful touch meant to welcome guests. At the far end of the foyer stood a 2-sided marble clock of extraordinary size and weight. Workers reportedly had to reinforce the floor beneath it, simply to prevent it from collapsing into the basement below. The main living room was filled with couches, chairs, and layered rugs. In one corner stood a grand piano, its surface covered with dozens of framed photographs. Images of Michael alongside family members and close friends, arranged so densely that they covered the entire top of the instrument. Over time, an enormous amount of money was poured into developing the estate into a fully self-contained world. Carnival rides, a small private railway, a dedicated movie theater, and meticulously planned gardens blended fantasy with everyday life. Even the hidden working areas, the maintenance rooms, storage facilities, and service buildings were designed with care because keeping the illusion of that magical world alive required constant, invisible effort. The kitchen alone was of commercial scale, equipped to serve a large staff and to feed the many guests and workers who moved through the property. Jackson would take his breakfast and lunch at a round table near the window, a surprisingly ordinary habit in an otherwise extraordinary setting. His private master bedroom suite reflected the same duality. A security panel near the entrance allowed him to monitor who was approaching. A peephole in the door gave him the ability to see who was knocking before he chose to answer. The bedroom itself was built across 2 floors, the main sitting area filled with couches and chairs, designed not just for sleep, but for living. Every grand illusion has infrastructure behind it. At Neverland, that infrastructure was hidden in plain sight. As the fantasy world grew larger, it required more facilities to maintain it. Storage buildings and warehouses became essential, holding everything from ride components and vehicle parts to gardening equipment and seasonal decorations needed to operate the amusement areas. These spaces were never intended for visitors. They existed purely for practical use, invisible to the guests who wandered the grounds, enjoying the carefully curated experience on the surface. Because they were so rarely seen, they also became part of mythology surrounding the ranch. When a decision was finally made to open them, People expected a relatively straightforward inventory of stored equipment. What they found was something far more layered. One of the most striking discoveries was a personal garage area, where time appeared to have genuinely stopped. Inside sat a collection of Rolls-Royces, not merely stored but preserved. They had been carefully maintained, rarely touched, sitting in almost frozen stillness as though they were waiting for their owner to return. These were not vehicles in the ordinary sense. They were preserved symbols of a very specific chapter of Michael Jackson's life, held in place by the same impulse that led him to keep so many things exactly as they were. Alongside the cars were personal notebooks and private materials that offered a quieter and more intimate glimpse into his world. These were not staged documents or performance notes designed for public consumption. They were fragments of private thought, planning, reflection, and personal writing stored away from the relentless spotlight he lived under for decades. One document in particular stood out, a tour itinerary from 1979, discovered among the materials, that included what amounted to a personal mission statement written in Jackson's own hand. He would have been 21 years old when he wrote it. The document read, in part, "MJ will be my new name. No more Michael Jackson. I want a whole new character, a whole new look. I should be a totally different person." He wrote about his intention to study the entire world of entertainment and fundamentally change how people perceived him, moving beyond his years at Motown and his identity as a member of the Jackson family. It was a declaration of reinvention from a young man who would go on to fulfill almost everything he described, on a scale few artists in history have ever matched. When the garage was open after all those years, it did not feel like walking into a luxury collection. It felt like stepping into a paused chapter of a life. Everything left exactly as it was, still holding the atmosphere of someone who had once moved through it daily. Beyond the cars and documents were objects that carried their own weight. A diorama built specifically for Jackson, constructed by Disney, sat among the preserved items. Framed photographs, personal mementos, and gifts from friends were scattered throughout the space. One item stood out particularly, a gift inscribed with the words, "MJ Love E.T., a personal note from Elizabeth Taylor, reflecting the genuine closeness of their friendship. His clothing was there too, original socks, shoes he had actually worn on stage, a costume connected to his legendary performance of Billie Jean on the Motown 25 television special in 1983, the night he debuted the moonwalk to a stunned global audience. Those who knew him still recall how he described that performance afterward. Even after the crowd erupted and the standing ovation rolled through the theater, Jackson was dissatisfied with himself. He felt he had not stayed on his toes long enough after the spin. No one in the audience would have noticed, but he noticed. He always noticed. Michael Jackson's legacy did not fade when he died on June 25, 2009. In many ways, it grew, rather than diminishing. His cultural and financial influence continued to expand in the years that followed. He became one of the highest-earning deceased celebrities in history, generating more revenue through music sales, streaming, licensing, and ongoing projects than most living artists. Within the first 4 years after his death, his estate earned over $600 million, more than any single living artist earned over the same period. The transformation was not inevitable. At the time of his death, Jackson carried approximately $500 million in debt, accumulated through years of borrowing against his assets. The estate executors, attorney John Branca and longtime friend John McClane, had to move with speed and precision to prevent creditors from dismantling everything that remained. The legal battles came quickly. Members of Jackson's family challenged both the validity of his will and the authority of Branca as executor. The California courts ultimately upheld both. The will itself had remained substantially consistent across multiple versions: 20% to charity, 40% to his children, and 40% to his mother Catherine during her lifetime, reverting to the children upon her death. The most significant financial asset was not Neverland. It was the music. During his lifetime, Jackson had made a series of publishing acquisitions that would prove transformative. He purchased the ATV catalog, which contained a significant portion of the Beatles' songwriting library, for $47.5 million in 1985. The catalog was later merged with Sony's music publishing.